And they don't want to address the objective changes, which are about, as I say, scale and speed of migration and the change in the way that people live and work and cluster. Nobody wants to talk about that because it's really difficult. And I'll tell you the thing that people most loathe. They most loathe the idea that there are some minority groups who, by their own efforts, overcome the difficulties.
Hello and welcome to Spectator TV. In today's Britain, is class actually a bigger barrier to success than race? A new report from the think tank Policy Exchange suggests that it might be so, even though the received wisdoms of recent years has been to focus more on race. But actually, this report shows that maybe not all ethnic minority experiences can be grouped under one non-white label. I'm Cindy Yu, the Spectator's assistant editor, and joining me to discuss this is broadcaster and author Sir Trevor Phillips. Trevor, welcome.
Pleasure to be here.
Now, tell us about what stood out most to you from this report.
Well, the background of the report is that it is 10 years on since Policy Exchange produced a report of the same name, Portrait of Modern Britain, which, as it happens, was written by somebody whose name we now know, Rishi Sunak. And at the time, he brought it to me. I hadn't met him before, but he brought the draft to me, showed it to me, and talked to me about it. And I thought it was the most impressive piece of work on the diverse ethnic and cultural diversity of Britain that I had seen, including, annoyingly, work that I'd written myself. So this is a sort of revisiting of that project. And what I am most impressed by in it, written by Rakib Ehsan, who's a fellow at Policy Exchange, is that it really pinpoints the changes that have taken place since 2014. Here are some of the things that I think we should be thinking about. First of all, when we think about ethnicity and so on, we tend to think black, white, binary. Actually, what this report demonstrates is that the landscape in Britain is much richer, much more multidimensional than that. We found that there are 29 communities of more than 100,000 people who are either foreign-born or whose parents are foreign-born. In fact, they themselves are foreign-born in this country. And that varies from Brazil, Iran, Zimbabwe, as well as the big groups from India and so on. Why does that matter? Well, it matters because what it tells us is that diversity isn't just about how many people are not white have you got in the room. The important thing about diversity in this country is that it's actually that. It is different groups. And the thing that is most telling for me is that there is an assumption, always has been, that what would happen is over time we'd all become a bit more like each other and everybody would become a sort of, there's this terrible 1960s song about, what we need is a great big melting pot, big enough to take the world and all it's got, and we'd all become brown, middle brown type
like
people.
Beige.
Beige, exactly. We'd all become beige. Actually, what's happened in Britain is not that at all. Because we have these big communities, 100,000 people is a town, which is potentially self-sufficient with its own media, own shops, own financial institutions, travel agencies that can take you back to the old country. The diasporas are linked to the old country in a way that they couldn't be 40 years ago. Because, we go back and forward, the travel is cheaper and so on. What we actually have are a couple of dozen communities within Britain where actually you could live inside that community. It might be Zimbabwean, it might be Brazilian, and not actually have to talk to somebody who is outside that community. And in a peculiar way, the challenge that we face now is not the one we thought we would have to face, which is about discrimination and so on. The real challenge we face now is, what is it that means that somebody who is themselves foreign-born or one generation away, what is it that brings them into a place where they want to mix with people who are not like themselves? Because they don't necessarily need to.
To borrow Rakib Ehsan's words that he wrote about for Coffee House this week, he says that the Indian and the Chinese ethnic groups are the Manchester City and Liverpool of socio-economic integration. So just suggesting that between these communities, there are some that do better than others at integrating.
Indeed. And I would take this even further than we were able to do in the report. When he says Manchester City and Liverpool, there's an argument about which way round that is. But anyway, the point is both of these communities are effectively more successful, if I can use that word, in education. There's what I think will become a well-worn statistic that children of Chinese heritage on free school meals do better than the average not on free school meals, which is an extraordinary thing.
That's incredible.
It is almost true, by the way, of Indian children of Indian heritage. These groups do better in employment, more of them in professional work, have higher incomes. The Indian group have more homeowners proportionately than any other ethnicity. So what we're seeing is two things. One is some groups basically outpacing everybody. And what we're also seeing is a massive divergence between minority groups, where, you have, as you said, the Chinese and Indians right at the top, and actually you have Caribbeans, Somalis, for example, some Pakistani Muslim groups in some ways, way down below the average. So the picture is very much more interesting and trickier than I think we imagined.
Because typically the thought is that, the white majority run this country. The white majority run the establishment, run the media, education, politics, whatever it is, and everyone else is, some level oppressed.
Yeah.
I mean, so some people would say. But actually what you're pointing out is that some minorities do better than others, and so we need to dig into why that is. Is that right? And how race isn't the biggest divider?
Well, there are a couple of things I think that are important. First of all, there's just a matter of scale. It is the case right now that 10% of people who live in this country are foreign born. Something like 20 or 23%, I think, are the children of those individuals. It is almost certain that by 2040, something like a half of the people who live in this country will themselves have been foreign born or be the children or grandchildren of somebody who's foreign born. So basically, you'll have a nation where half of the country has antecedents somewhere else. And that will be quite a significant change in the mindset of the country. The second thing is, as you say, some of those groups will outperform in employment, education, by the way, health, life expectancy, other groups. So there is this really rather interesting and peculiar proposition that in this country, some ethnic groups are set fair to become an elite within Britain, rather than, as you say, a sort of orthodox narrative that anybody who is not white is basically an oppressed minority who, is lucky to get out of their ghastly estate and whose children are half-starved and whatnot. Actually, I think it's going to be quite different. And that, by the way, presents quite a big set of issues for what we now consider the majority. I mean, what happens in a society where one group, distinguished by its geography and its colour, has always thought of itself as being the lucky ones, and then discovers that actually they're not the lucky ones. That they are having to work for the son or daughter of the Indian family down the street. It's going to be a very different country.
Well, at the same time as the mainstream narrative is saying something else, talking about things like white privilege. Seems such a backlash to that phrase from people who are not privileged, who are white, and saying, what privilege do I have? And do you think that the riots this summer are basically the most violent manifestation of that social problem that we've seen?
Well, I think that the whole white supremacy thing and so on is broadly speaking, the problem with it is it's now beginning to run so counter to the reality that most people experience that it just sounds silly.
It sounds out of touch in its own way.
Completely out of touch. And for some groups of people, it is more than silly. It is enraging. Because if you are from, let's say, one of Britain's seaside towns, which are largely white, but absolutely miserable places because the tourist trade has gone. There are no new industries moving in. You walk down the front of some of these seaside towns from the Wash round to, let's say, Brighton. And what do you see? What you see are empty hotels with boarded up windows, but with asylum seekers standing outside. That's your country. And your children can't buy a house. If they have a job, it's probably going to be in a big town, 2-3 hours away. So when your grandchildren are born, they're not going to be around the corner as it was for your own generation. You've got to go and travel. The disruption that is signalled by the demographic change for many of those people is much deeper than we think it is. None of that justifies, hurling bricks at the police and so on. But let's not just say that that's happened because there's some people who've suddenly gone mad or suddenly wicked or suddenly whipped up.
Yeah, or have always been racist.
And that they've always been racist. That seems to me that the analysis of people who essentially, it's a rather small t conservative narrative, which says, actually, we're a country where everything's basically okay. There are just some bad people who are misleading some unhappy people, and that actually, if we tell them it's all going to be okay, and that we'll give them some jobs and so on, and everything's going to be like good like it was before, we're kidding ourselves, and we're kidding them, and they know we're kidding them. That's why they're furious, because we, the elite, are lying to them. It's not going to be like it was before.
Do you think it's the scale of change or the speed of change that is a problem here? What's going on? Because, Trevor, I don't put you down as like a anti-immigration advocate.
No.
So what's going on here?
No, I'm quite the reverse. I am inward migration is an inevitability. I also think it's a good thing for Britain for a very simple reason. And I know this might infuriate some of your viewers.
Go for it.
The point about most immigration to the West is that we get the best. Anybody who has come from a developing country will know that the people who are immigrants are by and large the odd ones. They are the ones who won't put up with what it always was like for their parents and grandparents. They're the ones in the village who are impatient, ambitious, enterprising, and they're also smart enough to put together resources that allows them to get somewhere. So, my parents, I'm the 10th of 10. It takes quite a lot to decide to pick yourself up, pick up those children. I mean, I was born here. The other 9 were born in what was then British Guyana. It took quite a lot for my parents to pick us all up, bring us here, have another one, and make a life for us. Now, they were very special people. So we actually get the best of the best when it comes to immigration. So immigration is a good thing. But you can't pretend that immigration on the scale of net, let's say 500,000 or 750,000, is the same thing as immigration in the 1950s when my parents came, when there were 3,000 or 4,000 net a year. And most of those 3,000 or 4,000 came from the same place. They came from the Caribbean, Christians who knew the British, who spoke English and so on. We're now in a situation where, as I say, the net number is 500,000, 750,000, coming from 20, 25 different countries, all with different traditions, all with different ways of looking at the world. And by the way, unlike the 1950s and 1960s, though most immigrants come here because they like the way of life, they're not going to simply abandon who they were. It's a very different proposition to what it used to be. And we don't have the habit of preparing for integration, and we have no institutions or policy that create an integrated society. And I'll make one last point. What is different to the 1950s is that when my parents came here, there were institutions that in a way lent themselves to integrating newcomers, the churches, the trade unions. You worked in big factories or big organizations where there might be, 5, 10 or even 20% immigrants, but there were 80% non-immigrant natives you were working next door to. Today, the shape of the economy is such that that doesn't automatically happen. There aren't a million. My father worked for the post office. I can't remember how many men would have worked and women would work for the post office then, but probably hundreds of thousands. You don't have those kinds of workplaces anymore that force people together. So everything about our modern society, both the numbers, the scale and speed of arrivals, and the shape of what people do when they're here, is, if you like, antagonistic to the natural organic process of integration. And that means that's why you need public policy to counter the tendency to segregation.
But the politicians need to recognise what the problem is first in order to kind of have the prescription. Yes, and if I am honest, I think most politicians do recognise it, but they're absolutely terrified to articulate it. And they really don't want to talk about it. So what they do is they say, yes, it's all very difficult, but actually it wouldn't be so difficult if there weren't really bad people stoking division, and that actually if only we silence the bad people, then everything would be lovely. And they don't want to address the objective changes, which are about, as I say, scale and speed of migration and the change in the way that people live and work and cluster. Nobody wants to talk about that because it's really difficult. I'll tell you the thing that people most loathe, and that's one of the things that comes up that comes out of this report. They most loathe the idea that there are some minority groups who, by their own efforts and through their own cultural propositions and behaviours, overcome the difficulties. Because you know what that means? It means that actually everybody else might have to learn from those groups and change the way they do things.
Sorry to interrupt. We have a brand new offer. Subscribe to The Spectator today for just £12 for 12 weeks and you'll receive a free £20 John Lewis or Waitrose voucher. Can't beat that. Go to www.spectator.co.uk/voucher and claim this offer now.
Do you think that politicians or the ideology of the right is better suited to understanding all of this than the left? Or at least it's the way it's played out in the UK in terms of British politics. I mean, we look at the Conservative Party. Rishi Sunak, you mentioned, is the first Asian British Prime Minister. The Conservative Party, on average, on the front bench in the last decade or so, has had more diverse makeup than the Labour Party.
It's a really interesting question. I would say, actually, that neither left nor the right really understands what's going on. I think they both have their blind spots. The problem for Labour is that it has always had the vote of the large minority groups, or it's always persuaded itself, and that's been true for a long time. It is now confronting the fact that one or two, certainly the Indian group, have already drifted away from it. Our report says also the Chinese group are drifting away from the Tories, that Labour can't take that for granted. Labour's problem is, and here is another big alarming issue, that the minority groups both are more unlike each other than they are unlike the average person. But to be frank, quite often they more dislike each other than they like anybody else, which is why you have the conflicts, let's say, between Hindus and Muslim Indians in Leicester, which is a new feature of our public life. So Labour has quite a big problem, which is that its traditional vote is not secure, and that also it has to reconcile the differences between different groups that have traditionally supported it.
Yeah.
And because globalization means that issues which were big issues abroad are now on British streets, that's another problem for Labour. You know, its single biggest pillar of support, Pakistani and Bangladeshi Muslims. What does it say to the traditional Labour voting Jewish community?
I was going to say, Israel-Gaza is an imported, we're having this debate here.
So there's a big problem for Labour in that respect. For the Tories, there's a different sort of problem, which, to put it absolutely at its simplest, is its ghastly history when it comes to minorities. And the fact that until very recently, Tory amongst minority communities was basic code for racist. Now, I think that's changing. And I think actually something interesting is happening in some Tory constituencies in which they rather pride themselves on the fact that they elect or select candidates of colour, whereas minority Labour MPs tend to come from constituencies where a large part of the electorate is like them. If you look at the constituencies where Black and Asian Tory MPs are elected, by and large, there's almost nobody of colour in their constituencies. And I think what's happening here is that a lot of the associations, they've got past the, oh my God, oh my God, Cynthia, anyway, all that. They've got past that, and they are now actually rather proud of the fact that they, as they would see it, are colourblind in the way they make selections. And I think that was one of the things that the Conservative Party, initially anyway, liked about Rishi. It is one of the things I suspect it likes about Kemi, and probably James, cleverly as well. But I think it's one of the reasons that that they like Kemi, that she is a person who ostensibly and visibly shares the mainstream values, I think, of the current Conservative membership, and doesn't allow her colour to get in the way of that. To put it crudely, what Kemi is doing is saying, I'm a person of Nigerian heritage, I'm a Conservative, I don't think all Conservatives are racists, there might be one or two of the edges, but I think most Conservatives are decent people. What Tory is not going to like that message?
Yeah. Well, interesting that you bring up Kemi, because when you were talking earlier about the differences between migration now and in the 1950s in terms of the cultural affinities back then, whether that's faith or language or something else, compared to now. Kemi got into trouble recently for saying that not all cultures are, I think, equal was the word that she used. I don't want you to make you kind of defend Kemi Badenoch, as it were, but what did you think of that? Would you kind of agree with that? I'm sympathetic to the view that some cultures are more similar to other cultures and therefore assimilation is easier. As a Chinese woman, I find Japanese and Korean culture more easy to understand than perhaps other cultures. What do you think about that?
Well, look, there are a couple of things you've got to understand about Kemi. The most important thing to understand about Kemi is that she's Nigerian. And that's...
Spell out what you mean by that.
That means that she is combative, and she expects others to be combative. Right. There is a sort of, in my view, a sort of juvenile prissiness about British politics now, in which people are expected to somehow cloak their beliefs in a way that means that nobody can possibly object to anything they say. Whereas I think the point of politics is to object. I mean, the point of politics is to make a decision about whether we're going up, down, left, right. And if it doesn't matter, it's not a decision. If it does matter, people are going to care about it, and they are going to argue passionately that we want to go that way and not that way. So I am, I think, temperamentally a bit Nigerian, though I think in manners less so. I think that I think she's very direct, and that's the thing that people like about her. You never come away from a conversation with Kemi Badenoch
not knowing what she thinks.
Not knowing what she thinks. There's absolutely no possibility that you don't know what she thinks. And I think that's one of the things that people like about her. Whether she can find a register, a language, a tone that doesn't make that feel like she's walked into the room purely in order to punch you in the face is, that's her problem. If she becomes the leader of the Conservative Party, I'm sure that some of these creases will be ironed out. But the broader point you make about what she said about all cultures, not all cultures being equal, is a really, really important challenge, and it is a global challenge. The fact is that if you are Russian or Chinese, or probably Iranian, actually, what we do know is that the people who lead these countries aren't leading them by accident. They are leading them because a large proportion of their people, if not the majority, share their values. They share their way of looking at the world.
Yeah. And
the truth of the matter is, none of these people think that liberal democracy is much good. She doesn't think that. Putin doesn't think that. The Ayatollahs don't think that. The North Koreans don't think that. They want a different kind of world. And by the way, they are investing heavily time and money in persuading large parts of the developing world that they are right. And where my family comes from, in the Caribbean, there is a very strong strain of thought that says, yeah, democracy, yeah, but honestly, we need to put roofs over people's heads.
And so the Chinese money comes in.
Yeah, we need to feed people. And exactly, we can get it from Shanghai, or we can get it from Qatar. And yeah, I know the thing about women and all that, but honestly, the Qataris are helping, Yeah. So we are in a battle. We are in a proper struggle. And it is not a sort of conventional, kind of Washington, D.C. or London think tank seminar battle. It's a struggle for the soul of how people live and what is important. And I think that there is a tendency, again, in this, I think I found the word in this interview, thank you, a prissiness in British politics that says, serious politicians don't use vulgar, visceral language. Well, actually, in most of the world, most of the time, people only pay attention to politics because it's vulgar and it's visceral. And those of us who want to defend liberal democracy need to get our heads out of our backsides and stop saying to people, oh no, you can't talk like that. You mustn't be passionate. You must be reasonable and rational and nice. Because we're not battling people who are rational and reasonable and nice. We're battling people who want to live in a different way and want to make us live in a different way.
Okay, Trevor, so then bringing it back to the UK.
Sorry.
No, what's your policy prescription? If there are all these people in the world who think differently to the way that British people think, and they are, by sheer numbers, the majority of people, but you are also pro-immigration, you think say that they bring over their best. What is your policy prescription? How do you integrate people?
Well, I think there are a number of things that we've got to do. First of all, we've got to recognise the value of these groups of people and these diasporas. I mean, one of the things we don't seem to do very much is to elevate or privilege relations with these groups. So just to take, for example, the biggest and most important trading partner that we should probably have in the world right now, maybe aside from the United States, is India. I don't see any government of any colour embracing the Indian community and really loving it. Because actually, Indians here, particularly well-off Indians, middle class, they have brothers and sisters and uncles and aunts who are significant parts of the Indian middle class, are influential. We should be, just at a very practical level, making those people our advocates. They've chosen Britain, but they've got a foot in the old country, and we should be, just at a practical level, be working with them. We should be thinking, it's one of the things that I think Policy Exchange is now working on, we should be using the Commonwealth much more as an axis to advance our values of liberal democracy against the values of those who say, don't worry about the democracy, let's get you some guns and butter, and then we can think about democracy later. We should be making the case that our way of doing things not only gives people more freedom, it is more likely to produce innovation. It is more likely to create productivity. It is more likely to create sustainable development. And so these are things that we ought to be making the argument for, and we need to be able to demonstrate that we also believe in them, which is a whole other question. Because that relates to how we treat people elsewhere in the world. So there are a lot of things that we could be doing, but you're asking me in relation to the diversity of Britain itself. I think the most difficult thing is not the issue of discrimination and equality. We've got law. We should just enforce the law. But I think the biggest problem that we have, coming back to the point we discussed at the beginning of this conversation, is that some minority communities have brought things to Britain which Britain as a whole should pay attention to, should be studying, should be analysing, should be thinking about. When I was at the Equality and Human Rights Commission, I tried very hard to get a British university to do some research into why children of Chinese heritage were so successful at school. I mean, normally, if I turn up with 10 grand or 100,000 grand to a university campus, I need to make sure that my arm's still attached to me because people have bitten it off. I could not get a single academic group
to be interested.
Well, they were interested, but they wouldn't take it on. Why? Because, and I had this conversation with 2 or 3 of them, it would stigmatise others. Well, this is ridiculous. This is ridiculous. Unless you happen to believe in racial biology, which I do not, I don't think there's anything particular about your genome that makes you smarter than me. But I do think that there are probably things in your background that might make you more capable in certain areas. And some of that is reflected in academic attainment. Now, can we understand what that is?
Yeah.
Because if we do understand what that is, then there's a long tail of failure amongst Caribbean, some African, poor white Britons who need to learn what that secret sauce is. And the fact that we are too sort of coy and silly about it is not just a kind of political thing. It is the fact that we won't do that is betraying literally hundreds of thousands of children who could do better, who could be the people that then compete for jobs with the clever immigrants. I mean, that in the end that's the most self-defeating proposition on both left and right. The right doesn't want to have immigrants in, so, no growth because nobody do the jobs. The left doesn't want to learn how our children become more successful. And then, surprise, surprise, they can't compete with the immigrants, or they can't do the jobs that we need done, so we need to import people from Bangalore. actually there is a better way to deal with this diversity, to take advantage of it, than we are adopting at present. But we have to be honest with ourselves. We have to look at the facts. We have to stop thinking that all the issues of diversity are all about how white people are kind to black people, and really treat this like any other social problem or opportunity, because that's in the end what it is, a great opportunity.
And I would actually go a little bit further to say that some of the things that go into successful immigrant families, maybe the white middle class or upper class know about, and they do.
100%.
For example, parents that are ambitious for you.
100%.
Stable marriages, single parenthood, things that parents who read to you, things like that. That then actually it becomes even more concerning that that's not being shared with other people.
I could not agree with you more. And in a way, this is part of the most shocking. This is a shocking part of it. And I hope you won't mind me saying this to you. There's a certain snobbery, particularly about the academic attainment of Chinese children. Because what you hear is, for example, isn't it terrible that Lang Lang's father bullied him into practicing and held him out over a balcony and traumatized him? I mean, Lang Lang hasn't been traumatized. Lang Lang's just turned out to be probably one of the three greatest instrumentalists of our time, and he's a happy bloke as far as I can make out. Yeah. But there's a sort of snobbery that says, oh well, proper parents don't insist that their children do this kind of thing. They don't lean on their children to read, to do their homework and so on, because what we want is nice, rounded children. Yeah, right. We'll have nice, rounded children who work for other people. Now, if we want our children to do well, let's copy success. And the people who are most likely to be saying this kind of nonsense are exactly as you say, the middle classes. And why? Because they want to hoard opportunity. They don't like the idea that working class, poor children do better than theirs. Sorry, that's the revolutionary in me coming out.
Burn it all down. No, I mean it's the white middle class parents who send their kids to private school, who give their children tuition, but don't say anything about it.
Of course.
They don't want to give increased competition for their children. But some of the most ambitious parents I've ever met in my life, including the Chinese ones I've met, are actually white British.
And by the way, the middle classes, when it comes to this issue of education, are very conscious about all of this. Why? Because the minority groups, particularly the Indians, will sacrifice everything. They'll do 2-3 jobs. Mother and father will work in order to send their children to fee-paying schools, where they are next to the middle classes, and the middle classes in those fee-paying schools can see who's successful.
Yeah.
They can see what's coming down the road. So I have a friend whose son went to a very, the university I went to, Imperial College, and he left. And one of the things he said was that, I'm telescoping it here, couldn't compete with all of the students who had come, particularly from Southeast Asia, Malaysia, China and so on, who are mathematicians. And because they were just much better at it. Now, I think this is a bit way down the road, but I think it's a real thing that at some point we're going to have to get used to the idea that there will be groups of people from different minority groups who become very good at something. I mean, to take a sort of obvious example, if you were to pick a random Premier League team and populate it randomly from the population, you wouldn't have a team that is 40 or 50% people of African descent. But that's actually the reality, because people of African descent have become very good at doing that particular job. I think you would find I run a recruitment company at executive level. If you want to find really talented, highly capable Asian women, you go into the finance department of any very large company. We're all going to have to get used to the idea that it's not as simple as white people bad and oppressive, people not white, miserable, uneducated and down-pressed, and that, you know, all people who are not white look the same and act the same and all that. We have to get our heads out of that particular universe, because that's not the universe that we're in, and certainly not the universe that we're going to be in. To remind you, the point is, the numbers are going to make it very, very difficult to sustain the old black-white binary. And that's what's so, I think, interesting and telling about what Rakib Ehsan's done in this report.
Trevor Phillips, thank you so much for joining Spectator TV.
My pleasure.